evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Shandor in the Bronx, Paula in the Great Northwest, Guy in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Belle in Texas, Lorraine in Texas, Bella in Florida, Yehuda in South Carolina, Karen in Northern California, John in Maine, Bill in Missouri, excuse me, excuse me. Nancy in North Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Spencer in Connecticut, Ella's in the house, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida, Mickey is having cancer surgery tomorrow. Please pray for me. It is called MOH surgery. It's near my eye on my cheekbone. I'm frightened, but I know Hashem will protect you. Mickey, may we hear only good news. May you have a successful procedure and a complete and speedy recovery, a refuah shlema. May God bless you with all these things, and we say amen. We'll be praying for you, Mickey. Also, reminder, the 17th of Tammuz begins tonight. The fast is tomorrow, so we enter the 3 weeks. These are the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, the same date on which both temples, the first and second temple, was destroyed, as well as a bunch of other calamities in Jewish history. This date that begins tonight, several things happened on it in Jewish history as well, but mainly it's that's when the walls of Jerusalem were breached and the defeat and the destruction of the temple became inevitable, definitely in the second temple period, and some say same thing happened in the first temple period. So it's a very sad day that begins tonight, but the fast is a daytime fast. In the summer, that's a long fast, so you can get up early tomorrow and eat well before dawn. In LA, you'd have to eat before 4:30 a.m. I forget the exact time. If you want to have breakfast before the fast begins. By the time we're learning tomorrow evening, we may be irritable, but we'll do our best. And then I need to look this up. Then Tisha B'Av is in 3 weeks. Now, on Tisha B'Av, I feel like we must have dealt with this question 3 other times. Because you're not supposed to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av. But question if you're doing Daf Yomi or in your regular schedule that you learn every day, what will we do? Perhaps we'll skip learning on Tisha B'Av, but I need to ask my Rav and do a little bit of research about that question. At any rate, that's not for 3 weeks. Tomorrow, our schedule is the normal schedule. We will be learning on 17 Tammuz. Okay. Our daf today is page 28. We actually are going to pick this up on 27b with Mishna number 13. We have 2 short Mishnayos, 13 and 14 of chapter 2, and then God willing we'll wrap up chapter 2 today and open chapter 3 with Mishnah number 1 in chapter 3. Let's get to it. Mishnah 13 in chapter 2. With regard to a tree that leans into the field of another, and the neighbor, with regard to a tree that leans into a neighboring field, the neighbor, excuse me, the neighbor may cut the branches to the height of an ox goad, raised over the plow in places where the land is to be plowed, so that the branches do not impede the use of the plow, right? So your neighbor, your tree, its branches extend over onto your neighbor's property. Minimally, he can cut any branches that are going to interfere with him working his field next door. So that's, the ox goad is sort of like, that's higher than the person, higher than the ox itself, so that the person can freely move under that tree and work his own field. But that's minimally. And in the case of a carob tree and the case of a sycamore tree, whose abundance of branches cast shade that is harmful to plants, well, then all the branches overhanging one's property may be removed along the plumb line. So a plumb line is if you put a weight on a string and hang it, that's going to make a perfectly vertical string. So you can place this string over the property line between the two properties, and any branches that grow into your property, from your neighbor's tree, you could cut it along that plumb line. In other words, anything that grows across the property line, you could cut. At least for these trees, which create a lot of shade. And if the neighbor's field is an irrigated field, then all branches of the tree are removed along the plumb line, seemingly whether it's a carob or a sycamore or any other tree. If it's going to interfere with an irrigated field, all the branches can be removed. And Abba Shaul says all barren trees are cut along the plumb line. That's Mishnah 13. Now, a dilemma was raised before them. Is Abba Shaul referring to the first clause of the Mishnah, which states that a tree extending into a neighbor's field is cut only to the height of an ox goad? And Abba Shaul maintains that barren trees have the same law as carob and sycamore trees in that they are cut along the plumb line? Or is he referring to the latter clause, which discusses an irrigated field, and he would permit cutting only barren trees along the plumb line, but not fruit trees? And the Gemara answers, come in here, a resolution of this dilemma, as it is taught in a Baraisa. With regard to an irrigated field, Abba Shaul says, all types of trees are cut along the plumb line because the shade is harmful to an irrigated field. Why is it irrigated? So that you can grow things there. What do growing things need? Sun. What's going to interfere with that? Your neighbor's tree. So if his tree branches are growing into your property, you can cut them. And this shows that he does not dispute the law of the latter clause. And learn from it that he is referring to the first clause of the Mishnah. And the Gemara affirms, learn from it that this is so. Rav Ashi said that the wording of the Mishnah is also precise, as it teaches all barren trees. Granted, if you say that Abba Shaul is referring to the first clause of the Mishnah, this is the reason that Abba Shaul teaches all barren trees. But if you say that he is referring to the latter clause, he should have said simply barren trees, as the first Tana permits one to cut down any type of tree. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from it that he is referring to the first clause? And the Gemara affirms, learn from it that it is so. And that's it for Mishnah 13. Now, Mishnah 14, the final Mishnah of chapter 2. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. With regard to a tree that extends into the public domain, one cuts its branches so that a camel can pass beneath the tree with its rider sitting on it. And Rabbi Yehuda says one cuts enough branches that a camel loaded with flax or bundles of branches can pass beneath it. And Rabbi Shimon says one cuts all branches of the tree that extend into the public domain along the plumb line so that they do not hang over the public area at all due to ritual impurity. Now, what's interesting about this law, both in the Mishnah and in the note here about how this law came out, which is just like the Mishnah, and how it's listed in Shulchan Aruch, what's not addressed is who does the cutting. Are they saying that if your branches hang over into the public domain where they might interfere with people riding their camel down the street, that therefore you, the property owner whose trees hang into the public domain, you need to trim your trees? Or are we saying that, the town might hire tree trimmers who, trim all the branches that hang into the public domain for the benefit of the public, and that the private property owners cannot complain? I don't know the answer to that. It just doesn't say who are we talking about. What we're saying is they are removed so that they don't cause that damage. Who's responsible for removing them? I'm not sure. I'm going to guess they're talking more like what we would think. Certainly the way things happen in the city is that people have trees near the street. Yeah, they don't trim their trees unless, branches fall on a car, and they might be responsible for that. But just because they stick out into the public domain, people don't trim their trees. But the city maintenance crews certainly do trim trees that are going to interfere with cars rolling by, and the private property owners cannot complain about that. That's the way I'm understanding it. Okay, that was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The Gemara asks, who is the Tana who taught with regard to damage that one follows the current assessment and future damage is not taken into account? So the Mishnah states that the tree's branches are cut to the height of a camel and its rider or load, but no more, despite the fact that they will certainly grow again. And Reish Lakish says this law is taught as a dispute, and it is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. As we learned in the Mishnah on page 60a, one may not make an empty space beneath the public domain by digging pits, ditches, or caves. And Rabbi Eliezer permits one. I'm sorry, Nina, if you're listening, please bring me a glass of water. I really need it. As we learned in the Mishnah, one may not make an empty space beneath the public domain by digging pits, ditches, or caves. Rabbi Eliezer permits one to dig a pit if it is subsequently covered with material strong enough that a wagon loaded with stones can travel on it without collapsing. If the cover can withstand such weight when the pit is dug, it is permitted, despite the fact that the cover might eventually rot. So even though it might cause damage in the future, it's still permitted now. Likewise, we're not going to say that you have to, remove the branches from the tree in such a way that they'll never grow back. You just have to remove them so that they don't interfere now. And presumably when they start to interfere again, they get trimmed again. And Rabbi Yochanan said, you may even say, oh, thank you so much, honey. Appreciate that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol v'doro. Okay. Okay. So Rabbi Yochanan said, you may even say that the Mishnah here represents the opinion of the rabbis who prohibit one from digging beneath the public domain under any circumstances. And the difference is that there, the cover will occasionally deteriorate, and as this matter is not on his mind, it will cause damage. But here, as each branch grows, he cuts it off. Since the potential cause of damage is visible, there is no concern that it might be neglected. Again, not totally clear to me who's doing the cutting. Sounds like the owner of the property would cut his branches that extend into the public domain, but not clear. Now, the Mishnah teaches that if the branches of a tree extend into the public domain, one may cut them to allow a camel and its rider to pass underneath. One may cut them. So that again sounds like the city is doing the cutting. If it was the owner, you would say one must cut them. Rabbi Yehuda says one cuts enough branches that a camel loaded with flax or bundles of branches can pass beneath it. So that's a higher standard, right? You have to clear it further back because this is a much wider load than simply the height of a camel and its rider. Now it's the height of a camel, its rider, anything he's carrying on his back, and then the width especially, right? It's a much wider load. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Is Rabbi Yehuda's measure greater? Or perhaps the rabbi's measure is greater? Which reaches a greater height? A camel and a rider, or a camel loaded with flax? And the Gemara answers, it is obvious that the rabbi's measure is greater, as if it enters your mind that Rabbi Yehuda's measure is greater, how would the rabbis act in the circumstance of Rabbi Yehuda's measure? It is clear that a camel will have to pass beneath the tree with a burden, and it would not be able to do so. So the Gemara expresses surprise at this claim. Rather, what then would you say? That the rabbi's measure is greater? If so, how would Rabbi Yehuda act in the circumstance of the rabbi's measure? It is also clear that a camel will have to pass there with its rider. So the Gemara answers, it is possible for the rider to bend over and to pass underneath the branches. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Shimon says one cuts all branches of the tree that extend into the public domain along the plumb line due to ritual impurity. And the Gemara explains, a Tana taught in a Baraisa that this is due to ritual impurity imparted in a tent. That if you are under a roof with a dead body, even though you didn't touch the dead body, when you and the body are under the same roof, you become tameh with mace tuma, right, the tomb of a dead body, and you have to go through that 7-day purification before you can enter the grounds of the holy temple when the temple is standing, which is a big inconvenience. So here they're saying that it would be better to not have any overhanging branches in the public domain so that you won't come to, be under a roof accidentally, under a under a roof, in this case, a roof made by overhanging tree branches, with a corpse that maybe was being carried out of a house, and you were careful not to touch it, but then you ended up under the tree branches with it, and so you became, tameh with mace tuma, which requires a 7-day purification. And so that might be a reason to make sure there's no overhanging branches in the public domain. So the Gemara expresses surprise at this statement. It is obvious that this is the reason. We already learned that it is due to ritual impurity. How else could ritual impurity be transferred through branches other than by means of a tent? In other words, it's said that, at least according to one opinion, we cut back the branches because of ritual impurity. What other kind of ritual impurity could overhanging branches cause than, a tuma of a tent, or in other words, being under the same roof with a dead body? What other kind of ritual impurity would these overhanging branches cause? And the Gemara answers, if this is learned from the Mishna alone, our Mishnah, which says due to ritual impurity, I would say that the concern is that perhaps a crow might bring a source of impurity and perch on the tree's branches and throw it there, right? It might have something, perhaps even it might pick up a body part, and cast it down, and it hits you, and now you've been touched by a piece of human flesh that would impart impurity. Or it pick up some other source of impurity, a dead sheretz, right? A creeping thing that causes impurity, and the crow picks it up and then throws it down at you. It seems pretty unlikely, but you might have thought that. But if that were the only concern, a mere scarecrow would be sufficient to frighten the crows away, if the crows didn't get hip to the scarecrow. But a scarecrow would be sufficient to frighten the crows away and prevent that type of impurity. Therefore, the Tana of the Baraisa teaches us that the concern is due to impurity imparted by a tent, meaning that is what the Mishnah meant. That is the reason to remove overhanging branches from the public domain. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 14, and with it we conclude chapter 2 of Tractate Bava Basra. Now we turn to chapter 3, and we are indeed on page 28a. Mishnah number 1. With regard to the presumptive ownership of houses and of pits and of ditches and of caves which are used to collect water, and of dovecotes and of bathhouses and of olive presses and of irrigated fields which must be watered by people, and of slaves, and all similar property that constantly, meaning throughout the seasons of the year, generates profits, their presumptive ownership is established by working and profiting from them for a duration of 3 years from day to day. Meaning, if the one in possession of this property can prove that he worked and profited from it for the previous 3 full years, and that would include living in a house, but the other kinds of properties were all commercial properties where you're actually performing work on or with that property. So if you were using it, either residing there or using the olive press or the bathhouse or the irrigated field, or you were extracting something or storing something in a pit, etc., and you were using it on a continual basis for 3 years, then there is a presumption that it belongs to this person, and it would remain in his possession if another were to claim that the property belonged to him or to his ancestors. Now, obviously, the way to acquire a piece of property is not by squatting on it for 3 years, which in fact won't acquire it for you if there's proof to that effect. What they're saying is that in the absence of or let's say there was a proper kinyan, an active acquisition, and then the witnesses to the kinyan died, and the document, the bill of sale, is lost, and so there's no other evidence. Right now, the buyer of this property who acquired it legally would be telling his story and saying, well, I acquired this legally, I paid such and such amount of money to so and so the previous owner, etc. But if he lacks evidence to back that up, but on the other hand, he's been working that property for more than 3 years, and then the previous owner comes and says, I never sold that property to him. This guy's a liar. This is my property. Then the fact that he's been living on it or working it for 3 years will create a presumption that he did purchase it legally, that he is the owner, and now the burden of proof will be on the one making a claim, trying to remove this guy who has the hazaka. Right? The hazaka is a presumption that somebody owns something or has a right to be there that was created through this multiple of 3. Here, because he was living there 3 years, or because he came 3 days in a row, and that in other areas. But generally speaking, we say in terms of this presumption of ownership of these kinds of real property, that he had it for 3 years continually. Now, that's where somebody is living there day to day or working there day to day. Now, with regard to a non-irrigated field, i.e. one that is watered by rain, in which produce grows during certain seasons during the year, its presumption of ownership is established in 3 years, but they are not from day to day, since the fields are not worked and harvested continually throughout the 3-year period. There's times when nobody's dealing with that field, so it would seem like, well, he has to have harvested a crop there 3 years in a row, even though he is not personally going to be there every day because it's not an irrigated field. It doesn't require the continual presence of its owner. Rabbi Yishmael says 3 months of possession in the first year, 3 months of possession in the last year, and 12 months of possession in the middle, which add up to 18 months, but with time in each of 3 years, suffice to establish the presumption of ownership with regard to a non-irrigated field. Rabbi Akiva disagrees and says a month of possession in the first year, a month in the last year, and 12 months in the middle, which are 14 months total, this suffices to establish the presumption of ownership of a non-irrigated field. Rabbi Yishmael disagrees with both of them and says, in what case is this statement that 18 months are required for a non-irrigated field said? It is said with regard to a white field, bisde lavan, i.e. a grain field. But with regard to a field of trees, once he gathered his produce, and then he harvested his olives, and then he gathered his figs, these 3 harvests are the equivalent of 3 years. Since he harvested 3 types of produce, this is the equivalent to having possessed the field for 3 years. Now, these opinions of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael spoke twice, but in 2 different matters. So with respect to these opinions, these are minority opinions. The majority opinion is you just need 3 years. So let's see if these minority opinions are going to work. In terms of shrinking the amount of time needed, you don't need the full 3 years in the case of a non-irrigated field or in the case of a field that has different types of produce on it, like fig trees, olive trees, etc. Okay, that was mission number 1 of chapter 2. Now the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan says, I heard from those who traveled to Usha to study with the sages there that they would say, from where is it derived that presumptive ownership is established in 3 years? How do we get this law? Where do we find this in the Torah? We learn it from the case of the forewarned ox, right? So remember that if an ox gores and damages people or other animals, there's going to be different liability for its owner if it was a forewarned ox or a tom, an innocent ox, right? So the forewarned ox means that this ox has been violent in the past. It has damaged people or livestock in the past, and the owner was notified that his ox had gored, in fact had gored 3 times, right? So even the first and second times doesn't going to change the status. When his ox causes injury 3 times, now if it does it again a 4th time, this guy's going to have a much higher level of liability. So it took 3 times to change the status of the ox from an innocent ox to a forewarned ox, right? From an innocent ox to a dangerous ox. And then once that status was achieved, its owner bears a much higher burden of liability in case there's damage, and of ensuring that his ox won't cause such damage. So the point is that it was the 3 instances that changed the status. So Rabbi Yochanan says we learn that you establish a presumption of ownership with 3 years of presence on a piece of property. We learn that out from the case of the forewarned ox. Once it has intentionally gored 3 times, it leaves the presumptive status of an innocent ox or an innocuous ox, and it is established as having the presumptive status of a forewarned ox. So here too, once he has worked and profited the land for 3 years, the land left the possession of the seller, and it is established as being in the possession of the buyer. Now the Gemara questions this comparison. If so, say that just as with a forewarned ox, the owner is not liable to pay full damages until the 4th goring. With the gorings, 3 gorings establish it as a forewarned ox, but the 3rd goring, you still don't have the liability of the forewarned ox. It's only when the 4th goring happens that now he has to pay at that higher level. So says the Gemara, you don't actually change the status till the 4th time. It's the first 3 that establish it, but now, for the liability difference kicks in at the 4th goring. So here too, the land should not be established as being in the possession of this apparent owner until the 4th year begins. And the Gemara rejects this question, or maybe even the 4th year is completed. And the Gemara rejects this question. How can these cases be compared? There, in the case of the ox, once it has gored 3 times, it is considered a forewarned ox. Now we're on 28b. And the requirement for there to be another 4th incident for the owner to be liable to pay full damages exists because before it gores, after having become a forewarned ox, what is there for the owner to pay? There's no incident until there's a 4th goring. But here, once he has worked and profited from the land for 3 years, the land is established as being in his possession. Now, the Gemara asks, if that is so, according to the explanation that the forewarned ox is the source for the presumption of ownership with regard to land, then even possession that is not accompanied by a claim, i.e. where the possessor has no explanation as to how he acquired it, should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Just as goring 3 times automatically establishes it having the status of a forewarned ox. So why do we learn in a Mishna on page 41a that any possession that is not accompanied by a claim explaining how the possessor became the owner is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? It's not enough that this guy's been living in that house for 3 years, or this guy's been farming that field for 3 years. He also has to be able to say how he acquired it legally. It's not that it's automatically his. He gets the presumption of ownership if he can also explain how he came to own that property. I bought it from so-and-so for such and such amount of money. Whereas with goring ox, once it's, has been witnessed to have gored 3 times, boom, it's a forewarned ox. There's no other requirement. And the Gemara answers, what is the reason that possession that is not accompanied by a claim is not sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership? Because in a standard case where one has presumptive ownership, we say that even if the claimant proves that the field was once his, this other guy who's coming and saying, I never sold you that field, we say that even if the claimant proves that the field was once his, since this other guy is now in possession of the land, perhaps the truth is, as he says, that he purchased it from the previous owner. But now that he himself does not claim that he purchased it, will we claim this for him? Right? He has to claim that it's his. If he doesn't claim that it's his, if he's just mum about that, about how he came to be there working it for 3 years, then we're not going to make that claim for him, right? And that's why we require this claim, but we don't have any analogous need to add a requirement to the forewarned ox. Now, Rav Avira objects to the explanation that the presumption with regard to land is derived from the law of a forewarned ox. If that is so, a protest that the claimant lodges during the 3 years, not in the presence of the possessor, should not be considered a protest, because it must be similar to the law of the forewarned ox. Now, with the forewarned ox, we require that it's not just that, some court somewhere establishes that this particular ox gored 3 times. Right? In other words, the owner of the ox is not warned unless he heard about it. He has to know that his ox gored, right? So that has to be established in his presence for now to us to take his liability level up many notches when the 4th goring happens and say that he's liable for all damages at a higher level from his superior quality land, all the other things that kick in. But that's only going to make sense if we know that he was warned, right? That he was told, that he was aware that his ox had gored. So what they're saying now is, well, that's the law of the forewarned ox. So therefore, with the possessor, if somebody comes and makes a claim against the land and says that actually it's his, well, we would require that that claim be made in the presence of the possessor, right? That the possessor is brought to the courtroom for that purpose. And we don't have that requirement. And the Gemara answers that this is not difficult. There, with regard to a forewarned ox, it is written in the Torah, and warning has been given to its owner. That's Exodus 21:29, indicating that the warning must be issued in the presence of the ox's owner. But here, with regard to making a protest about who owns the land, well, your friend has a friend, and the friend of your friend has a friend, so that the protest will become known, even if lodged not in the presence of the possessor, as word of it will spread. There is no actual Torah edict mandating that the protest be lodged in his presence, and it is sufficient that he hears of it, even secondhand. So the fact that we don't have this requirement that any claim made against the land be made in the presence of the guy who's now in possession of the land doesn't disprove the fact that we can learn out this establishing the hazaka, the presumption of ownership, from 3 years of continual use. It doesn't disprove that we're learning that principle from the law of the forewarned ox, because the forewarned ox has that requirement of the warnings being given in the owner's presence. That's a requirement that wouldn't apply in the case of the land, and that's why the Torah didn't speak of it, but we can still learn out one principle from the other. Now the Gemara further asks, and according to Rabbi Meir, who says, when the ox performs its gorings at intervals, its owner is liable. If it performs its gorings successively, is it not all the more so the case that the owner is liable? So according to his opinion, the animal must gore only 3 times to become forewarned, and it is not required that the gorings occur on 3 separate days. They can all occur on the same day. And, it gored 3, like it never gored before, but then on one day the animal went crazy, gored 3 different people. The owner was told of it, and then it gored a 4th. So now he has the full liability of a forewarned ox, or that's what Rabbi Meir is saying. But it seems like the majority would say, no, these gorings have to occur over a space of time, at least on 3 different days, not all on the same day. So similarly, one could say that if he profited, the guy who's in possession of this field, that if he profited from the field by consuming 3 fruits of, for example, a fig tree within 1 day, that should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. Now, this is based on that clause at the end of the Mishnah, which said you don't have to be in possession of it for 3 whole years. If you've got 3 different types of produce that grow there, let's say apple trees, olive trees, and fig trees that produce their fruit at different times of the year, and this same guy makes 3 harvests from that same orchard, then we don't need a full 3 years. We have 3 harvests. Right? Now, what about the fact that, the 3 harvests could all come in a very short space of time? That's a very different requirement than saying that somebody has to be in possession and be using a piece of land for 3 years. Now he could do it in a few days, and we're going to say that as an evidentiary matter. That's sufficient. It's a little bit surprising. And the Gemara answers, this would not be a valid comparison, as presumptive ownership with regard to land must be similar to the law of a forewarned ox, and just as with a forewarned ox, at the time when the animal has this goring, it does not have that goring, as each act of goring occurs at a separate time. Here too, in order for the consumption of the produce to establish the presumption of ownership, it must be at the time when this fruit is here and that fruit is not here. Meaning when all the produce of the field is extant concurrently, consumption of this produce does not establish the presumption of ownership, even if the produce is consumed at 3 different times, right? So the fact is, if all the trees are bearing this, their fruit at the same time, and he's harvesting, we don't have this idea of 3 different harvest periods, which is really what they were getting at when they said 3 different harvests. But if you've got trees producing fruit simultaneously, the fact that he picked fruit from 3 different trees is not going to, just like that, establish his presumption of ownership. Now the Gemara asks, based on this, if this guy in possession of the land profited from the field by consuming 3 fruits within 3 consecutive days, for example, the fruits of a caper bush, whose fruits ripen day after day, that should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership, as all 3 fruits were not ripe at the same time. And the Gemara answers there, with regard to the caper bush, at least the fruit is here and it is in the process of finishing its ripening during the 3 days. And this is not similar to the goring ox, where each goring is fully independent of the other. Since they are coming ripe at approximately the same time, we could say there's a relationship between the harvests that would preclude establishing the presumption of ownership so quickly. I'm actually almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Now the Gemara challenges, based on this, if he profited from the field by consuming 3 fruits within 30 days, for example, alfalfa, which quickly regrows when cut, and which is repeatedly cut over a short period of time, that should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And the Gemara explains, what are the circumstances where the alfalfa could regrow 3 times within 30 days? Where it grows a little and he cuts and consumes it, where it grows a little more and he consumes it, such that he cuts it 3 times in 30 days. There, he is seizing and consuming the alfalfa, which is not the normal way of farming it, and consequently he does not establish the presumption of ownership, which is established only through standard use of the land. So the Gemara tries again, based on this, if he profited from the field by consuming 3 fruits within 3 months, for example, alfalfa, where he did employ the standard method of harvesting it, that should be sufficient to establish the presumption of ownership. And the Gemara explains, who are they who travel to Usha, whose opinion is under discussion? It is Rabbi Yishmael. And indeed, according to Rabbi Yishmael, this would establish the presumption of ownership, but Rabbi Yishmael's opinion was not the majority opinion. That's where we're going to leave off. But tomorrow we'll continue here on page 28b with the Gemara challenging this ruling that you can establish a presumption of ownership in less than 3 years if you conduct 3 different harvests on the same land. Okay. Questions. Joe, when you prune the tree, to whom does the wood belong? I suppose you're asking what we were talking about earlier, when your tree leans over into your neighbor's yard, and he says, I don't want these branches over my yard. They cause shade. They cause me problems. I'm going to drop a plumb line over the property line and cut off all the branches that grow onto my property. And now, what you're asking is a great question. Shows you've been listening. To whom does the wood belong? Now, you can look at that 2 ways. One is, this is just garbage, right? And the real problem is disposing of the garbage. So if the one who cut it, can he just then drop it on his neighbor's yard and say, hey, that's your wood, you deal with it? Or, since he's the one who cut it for his own benefit, maybe he has to dispose of it. Conversely, and I think maybe this is what you were getting at, if the wood has value, let's say as firewood, maybe there were some thick limbs that were growing onto the neighbor's property, and he cut those, and they have value as firewood. Can he keep them because they were growing over his property and he put in the work to do the cutting? Or does the one who owns the tree, and that this emerged from his tree and therefore it's his wood, should he receive the firewood when it is cut? I suppose that question would extend back to, do we follow the tree or do we follow the airspace over the land? We were debating that yesterday. I'm not sure that we came to a conclusive answer, so I'm not sure what the answer would be, but great question. Bill, not that unlikely. I guess we're talking about scarecrows. Crows and other corvids are famously intelligent, and I suppose the best word is playful. They've been known to throw things at people as a game. In terms of causing tuma, ritual impurity, to a person, not just because the tree branches overhead, created a roof that might be covering you and a dead body, but because it might attract crows, and the crows throw things down, and one of those might be a source of tuma. So they might throw things at people as a game. However, they have also been known to recognize individual humans, and some studies suggest they can share information about individual humans with other crows. So, if you had made an enemy of a crow in your neighborhood, who knows but that he and his avian buddies might not throw things at you out of spite. Best to avoid that fate and keep your bird feeders full. Yeah, not only that, crows are definitely smart. I believe they're known to be the smartest of all birds. You can see all these amazing videos about them, like doing math puzzles and geometry puzzles. And there's also a bunch of videos about, people who give food to the crows on a regular basis, and then the crows start bringing gifts and leaving gifts like shiny objects and sometimes even money in the place where they get fed. I've been leaving some food out for crows out front. I've not received any gifts. So I maybe haven't formed a good warm relationship with our local crows yet. Jonathan, 3 years proves property ownership, or at least creates a presumption of ownership. That would then have to be, that could be disproven, but it would be, the burden of proof would be on the other claimant. 3 years proves property ownership. This reminded me of the scams cases recently where other people sell your house or rent out an apartment that they don't own, like a false Airbnb rental. I wonder if this was an issue in those times, scammers, etc. I think that's a great question. I don't know. But I would say that criminality, theft, lies, violence, murder, as long as there have been people, those are issues that people have to deal with. I think the vast majority of people are good, honest, hardworking people, but among us, there are these individuals who seek to take advantage. And we certainly see in the Torah that, there is an awareness of criminality and people who give into their basest impulses, and that there have to be punishments available, dictated for them, and procedures, and civil procedure and criminal procedure and courts of law. So I would not be surprised if that kind of thing came up then. Jonathan also says about 3 years, so is there no active acquisition that a buyer can do to the land beyond working it for 3 years? No, he absolutely can. What the sages are saying here, the sages are being realistic and saying sometimes people lose the deed. People lose the property. Or somebody who was just not very educated, neither the previous owner nor the new owner, they weren't so careful. They just did a handshake deal privately. One gave a bag of money, the previous owner left town. And then let's say that the previous owner's son arrives and says, well, this is my father's land. He died and now I'm come to take it over. And the guy who's been living there for a few years says, I bought this land from your father. And I gave him such and such amount of money and a bag of money. And then, he went off and left. And I've been here ever since. And the son of the previous owner could say, well, where are your witnesses? And maybe this guy had witnesses, but they're dead. Or maybe he was unsophisticated and he didn't have witnesses. So you see, there might have been a proper kinyan, a proper active acquisition, but the evidence is no longer here. So definitely the active acquisition over real property, which usually is, there's a purchase and sale, and then when it's time to finalize it, they exchange a symbolic object, often like a handkerchief, but in the presence of witnesses who also signed the deed, and then, it absolutely needs to be formalized properly. It's just that sometimes the evidence of that formal acquisition is gone and somebody rises up to make a claim. If we don't have this 3 years of ownership, then think about it. That kid who shows up and everyone says, well, yeah, the one who lived here before was his father. He left at some time ago. And so the presumption of ownership would be with this kid. And so now the guy who's been living on that property, let's say for less than 3 years, maybe he's been working there for 2 years. Now he would have to prove that it is his land. But if he's been there for 3 years, then this kid who shows up and says, my father died and this is my property, he has to prove, right? It's who has the burden of proof. And obviously that's a big deal because it's not always easy to bring enough evidence to extract money from a person. So whoever has that presumption of ownership is in the driver's seat when the litigation begins. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, for page 29. And if you're fasting, starting very early tomorrow morning, may you have an easy and